Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. In the first video, we had a look at the preface to the Discourse and addressed the central question that is really framing his argument. And that question, if you remember, was what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? We dealt with Rousseau's attempt to find some distinction among the types of inequality that we might experience in modern society, right? And Rousseau said that there are two general concepts of inequality to hold apart. The first was natural or physical inequality, and the second was social, or what he calls moral and political inequality. So now I want to pick up the thread and get a little bit more into details of the first part of the discourse, where he offers an alternative representation or idea about human beings in the state of nature. If you remember from Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, the idea of the state of nature is a kind of pre-social or pre-civilized human world where human beings are just living off of nature without any laws or governing authority. Rousseau is going to come to very different conclusions about what life was like in that state of nature. And at every turn throughout the piece, he will criticize Hobbes for having an overly pessimistic idea about the natural condition and an overly autocratic or perhaps totalitarian concept of the social contract. Okay. So just to get a little bit into one last sort of preamble from the preface here, Rousseau writes precisely what then is the subject of the discourse. This is on page 38. To mark in the progress of things the moment when, right taking the place of violence, nature was subjected to the law. So Rousseau is kind of asking, when did we start to treat nature as something that the law can adjudicate? And when did we stop thinking of nature as something that we just happen to share with other animals in the natural world? When did we start thinking of nature as the subject of law? To explain the sequence of wonders by which the strong could resolve to serve the weak, and the people to buy imaginary repose at the price of real felicity. So he's signaling to the reader that the modern world, the world of civil society, is a world of injustice where the strong subordinate or dominate the weak. And the implication here is that that was not always true, right? So he's showing his cards a little bit and revealing to us that he thinks the state of nature is not one of unjust inequality, and that it's only this long process of history that has produced the unequal and hierarchical world that we inhabit today. Okay, so that's kind of where he's heading, and we have to get a little bit more detailed about what that historical process is. All right, so in part one, Rousseau just returns once again to the state of nature. And you may have noticed from the readings that it is a very positive and kind of romanticized concept of the state of nature. It seems that human beings live like animals off of nature. They live by instinct. We live with a sense of survival. But we are like perfectly harmonized with nature. We're well adapted to deal with the pressures of our environment. It doesn't seem that we have much of a language to speak of. Rousseau speaks of language just being like cries, like animals, right? So perhaps our language had to evolve over time. It doesn't seem we have very sophisticated moral lessons or virtues to follow. It doesn't seem that we have any reflection at all, right? Rousseau says that human beings really just lived in the present. We were more or less solitary creatures living off of the land If an individual saw food on the tree, he or she would just eat the food and be content. There was no need to appropriate nature or to store and carve up nature into property like we do today. So we had a very different and a much less dominating relationship to the natural world, right? So Rousseau spends a lot of time criticizing past philosophers, including Hobbes, who have mistaken this original human condition. Rousseau has kind of reversed the Enlightenment idea that it's only rationality, science, and technology that makes human beings worthwhile. Rather, those things are probably contributing factors to our corruption and our immorality and perhaps our inequality, as we'll see as the essay unfolds. So he writes here on 40, when the earth is left to its natural fertility and covered with immense forests that were never mutilated by the axe, it offers storehouses and shelters at every step to animals of every species. Men, dispersed among the animals, observe and imitate their industry, and thereby raise themselves to the level of animal instinct. Okay, so human beings exist in the mode of imitation. We imitate other animals and we sort of copy or mimic their ability to adapt to nature. And that's our basic mode of survival with the natural world, right? We just sort of imitate, with the advantage that whereas each species has only its own instincts, man, who may perhaps have none that belong to him, appropriates all of them to himself, feeds himself equally well on most of various foods, which the other animals divide among themselves, and consequently finds his sustenance more easily than any of the rest can. So Rousseau is sort of saying something that is commonly shared amongst human beings, and something that is different. Human beings share with animals the circumstance that we adapt to our environment through instinct, through the need to survive, to preserve ourselves. But what is different is that we have the ability to appropriate all modes of survival within our own activity. So we do have this little bit of competitive advantage, let's say, over the rest of nature. And that will be a source of human beings' attempt to separate itself from nature over time. Okay, I'll return to that idea. But just note that in the original state, we're not really all that different from any other animal. Okay. So Hobbes now appears here as sort of the enemy of Rousseau's argument, right? Hobbes had argued in Leviathan that in the state of nature, life was nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, and that human beings lived in the mode of competitive conflict, or that the state of nature was a state of total war. Rousseau totally disagrees with this and thinks that there's no reason to conclude from the fact that there wasn't law, the result that human beings would have been violent and perhaps evil, right? So he writes, Hobbes maintains that man is naturally intrepid and seeks only to attack and fight. On the other hand, an illustrious philosopher thinks, and Cumberland and Puffendorf also affirm, that nothing is as timid as man in the state of nature, and that he is always trembling and ready to take flight at the slightest sound he hears or the slightest movement he perceives. Okay, so what's Rousseau saying? What he's saying is that Hobbes is wrong to think that because of the absence of law in the state of nature, human beings would have been at war. On the contrary, we probably would have been timid or a little bit skittish in the presence of the dangers that each other posed to one another, with the result that we would just simply flee from each other and no conflict would have arisen at all, right? There would have been no like army or any kind of big infrastructure to facilitate the kind of wars that Hobbes seems to have believed would have existed in the original condition. So the state of nature is a condition of peace in Rousseau's mind. It's a condition of peace because there's no real material necessity to conflict. We all have all the food and supplies that we need. We live as pretty much isolated and dispersed beings in nature. So the state of nature has no real need for the kinds of conflicts that Hobbes supposed. Okay, so just to move forward a little bit, Rousseau will start to use the language of savage man or the primitive man, and that's language that in anthropology and the history of the natural history of humanity we have strayed away from. But just note that Rousseau is intending it as an ironical, positive term. He's kind of using this term as a critique of modern French Enlightenment society's kind of condescending attitude to pre-socialized beings. And Rousseau is kind of saying, actually, there's a nobility and a morality, perhaps, in virtue to the simplicity of the noble person in such a state. Okay. So he writes, therefore, we must not take care not to confuse savage man with the men we have before our eyes. So, this is going back to the preface where he's said that we are no longer recognizable to ourselves. The behavior and the psychology we see amongst modern people is incredibly different from our original constitution, right? Nature treats all animals left to their own devices with a partiality that seems to show how jealous she is of that right. The horse, the cat, the bull, even the ass are usually taller, and all of them have a more robust constitution, more vigor, more strength, and more courage in the forests than our homes. They lose half of these advantages in becoming domesticated. It might be said that all our efforts at feeding them and treating them well only end in their degeneration. It is the same for man himself. In becoming habituated to the ways of society and a slave, he becomes weak, fearful, and servile. His soft and effeminate lifestyle completes the enervation of both his strength and his courage. Okay, so Rousseau is making an analogy between the way we have domesticated animals over the course of history in a way that has rendered them weak and docile. And in a way, he's saying we have undergone a similar process of domestication that has rendered us weak and docile. But the difference is that the domestication has been self-imposed. We have created our own domestication, and he really is lamenting that fact. He thinks we have sort of lost touch with an originally strong and well-adapted physical and mental constitution, and that modern humanity is much more dependent on technology, medicine, the comforts of modern commodity living, with the result that we're way less harmoniously attuned to our natural environment, right? In ways that will bring about rather a lot of negative consequences, all right? So we've experienced a kind of similar downfall to a number of other animals, but that downfall is only the result of our own action. All right. There's a lot of details in the first part of the discourse that are basically so many indications that human beings lived in a condition of equality, peace, and contentment. I would say that those are the dominant attributes of the state of nature. There are a lot of reasons for that. The first of which is that nature is an abundant condition, unlike Hobbes, who believed that the state of nature was a condition of scarcity in which humans would have had to kind of scrap and claw to get what they needed for survival. Rousseau says there's no reason to suppose that this original nature would have been anything other than a plentiful and abundant place. And so since it's abundant and plentiful, individuals would have had no need to compete with each other. So he does not see competitiveness as a natural condition. On the contrary, human beings are pretty much content with what they have, and they have no psychology of power hungriness or acquisition or narcissism, as Hobbes had argued in Leviathan. All right. So there are many details here. I don't want you to feel as though you have to sort out and keep track of all of them. But I do want you to have just a kind of general sense of the kind of trajectory of the argument regarding the state of nature. Okay. A few other details emerge here. Rousseau will talk about the idea of reflection and essentially philosophy and language. He tends to be a little bit of an anti-philosophical philosopher. He does not think particularly highly of rationality and reflection, at least here, because those are notions that seem to facilitate discontent and acquisition and material narcissism or gain. The human beings in their natural state are pretty much creatures of the present. All right. So just to kind of return to the moral issue, the issue of justice or injustice, once again, Rousseau thinks Hobbes has dropped the ball in his argument, as it were, right? So he writes here, above all, let us not conclude with Hobbes that because man has no idea of goodness, he is naturally evil. Okay, so if you remember, Hobbes had argued in The Difference of Manners and in The Natural Condition that because we don't have positively defined moral traits, that we therefore are completely willing to be evil in our behavior. Rousseau doesn't buy that story. He thinks it's true in a sense to say that natural humanity is amoral. We don't necessarily have well-defined moral concepts and categories in our nature, but there's no reason to infer from that that we would have been like bloodthirsty and power hungry, right? That he is vicious because he does not know virtue, that he always refuses to perform services for his fellow men he does not believe he owes them, or that by virtue of the right, which he reasonably attributes to himself, to those things he needs, he foolishly imagines himself to be the sole proprietor of the entire universe. Hobbes has very clearly seen the defect of all modern definitions of natural right, but the consequences he draws from his own definition show that he takes it in a sense that is no less false. Were he to have reasoned on the basis of the principles he establishes, this author should have said that since the state of nature is the state in which the concern for our self-preservation is the least prejudicial to that of the others, that state was consequently the most appropriate for peace and the best suited to the human race. So Rousseau is kind of saying that had Hobbes been consistent with his own argument, with the logic of his argument, if he had been consistent in showing that the primary driver of human action is self-preservation, he should have concluded that it would have been in our best interests to be peaceful with one another in the natural condition rather than violent and warlike, because the condition of peace is actually, by his own reasoning, the condition that best facilitates our self-interestedness. Okay, so Hobbes has that kind of gotten the buggy before the horse. He has taken the condition of war that he saw in modern day life, in the condition of civil war in England, and has sort of transferred it onto an imaginary state of nature. But he has distorted humankind in the process. So he says precisely the opposite, because he had wrongly injected into savage man's concern for self-preservation the need to satisfy a multitude of passions, which are the product of society and which have made laws necessary. Okay, so Hobbes has injected into the concept of nature the evils that are really only the product of social and modern institutions. Institutions like a failed state, laws that no longer work, perhaps a broken economy, things that indeed do drive people into relations of violence and competition. But Rousseau says that in the state of nature, which would have been a condition of abundance without natural alliances or social alliances, there's no reason to suppose that human beings would have been anything other than peaceful and free. So just as a kind of big picture takeaway from the first part, Rousseau is saying that human beings are in a condition of peace. They're in a condition of adaptation and imitation with nature, and they're not competitive. They're basically content with the resources they have. Okay. Um, Now, on the issue of what Hobbes called egocentrism or vainglory, the idea that we're kind of narcissistic and interested in our own power, Rousseau similarly thinks that that's kind of a kind of fallacy that was imported from modern civil society. There would have been no sense of egocentrism stemming from the need to survive oneself. Okay, so Rousseau here will highlight what he believes to be the most essential trait of human nature. All right, and he says that the trait is our natural feeling of pity, pity in particular for the suffering of other human beings. He argues that it is such a strong feeling, this kind of instinct we have to feel pain in the presence of someone else's pain, that other animals themselves seem to show similar signs of such a condition. All right, so pity is in a way um, maybe not our moral foundation, but it's at least the natural basis upon which we can become sympathetic to each other. All right. So Rousseau writes here, moreover, there is another principle that Hobbes failed to notice, and which, having been given to man in order to mitigate in certain circumstances the ferocity of his egocentrism or the desire for self-preservation before this egocentrism of his came into being, tempers the ardor he has for his own well-being by an innate repugnance to seeing his fellow men suffer. So we have a hatred of seeing suffering in others. I do not believe I have any contradiction to fear in granting the only natural virtue that the most excessive detractor of human virtues was forced to recognize. I am referring to pity, a disposition that is fitting for beings that are as weak and as subject to ills as we are, a virtue all the more universal and all the more useful to man, in that it precedes in him any kind of reflection, and so natural that even animals sometimes show noticeable signs of it. All right, so this is kind of the core moral essence of human being for Rousseau, the feeling of pity, specifically the feeling of pity for the suffering of others. And it's precisely that quality that Hobbes ignored or failed to theorize that means his whole concept of nature was wrong. So as you can see, Rousseau has a much more positive and romantic concept of human nature than Hobbes, and it's founded upon a natural disposition of pity or empathy. And it's that condition that provides the basis for us to have a concept of justice and right and wrong once we enter civil society. Okay, so he has kind of shown how there is a natural basis to the horror and antipathy we will feel in the face of the suffering brought on by others in the modern world. Okay, so we'll return to that in part two, and Rousseau will try to address what happens to pity once we get into civil society. But just by way of summary, Rousseau has given us a positive conception of the state of nature as against Hobbes' negative concept of the state of nature. And the state of nature is a condition of equality, it's a condition of peace, it's a condition of contentment, and it's a condition of pity. So those are the dominant attributes of the state of nature. In part two, he will have to explain how we ever transitioned from out of the state of nature to form civil society. What events had to take place that brought about the distortion and corruption of human nature over time. Okay, so read part two with a particular focus on what events led to that kind of downfall. How did we spoil this perfect paradise of nature? Okay, we will continue the conversation next time and have a look at Rousseau's answer to the originating question: what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? Okay, until next time.